Wild Card Weekend is behind us. Johnny Sports Network here to provide you with my NFL playoff divisional round predictions. And I will be honest, I personally felt like Wild Card Weekend was disappointing. Out of all 6 games this past weekend, only one of them I was entertained by from start to finish, and that was the Rams and the Lions. In fact, if you take the margin of victory in all 6 games, the average was about 17 to 18 points per game. And when you take out the Rams and Lions, which was decided by 1 point, the average margin of victory in the other 5 games were 21.4 points. A 3-possession victory was the average this past weekend. And the divisional round is upon us, and I am hoping that we get some better games in the divisional round. I don't think we're going to get the divisional round we had 2 years ago, where all 4 games went all the way down to the wire. I'm hoping we get at least 2 of those games, but if we just got one of those games, I would at least be satisfied. And if I had to guess which game would go down to the wire, it would be Chiefs and Bills, because whenever these two go against each other, more often than not, does that game go down to the wire. And a quick recap of Wild Card Weekend. Again, I kind of felt disappointed with Wild Card Weekend, as I was hoping the games would be a lot closer than what they were. It looked like Browns and Texans was going to be a competitive game, but the Texans scored 35 unanswered points after trailing 14-10. The Dolphins and the Chiefs, in very cold weather, I believe it was the 4th coldest game in NFL history, and the Chiefs, they had a dominant performance. It was, in my opinion, the best game the Chiefs have played all season since the first time they played the Chargers. And I think maybe you can argue that the performance they had against the Dolphins this past Saturday night was their best performance all year long. As the Dolphins defense, they did just about everything they could, but the Chiefs were just too much for the Dolphins. The Dolphins offense just couldn't get much going on offense. The Packers went on the road to take on the Cowboys. The Cowboys had a significant winning streak at home, but the Packers, dominant from start to finish. I did talk about how if Aaron Jones got going quickly in this game, if they ran the ball early, often, and efficiently with Aaron Jones, then they would have a strong chance of pulling off the upset. And the Cowboys, they did score a couple touchdowns in the 4th quarter to make the game look closer than what it actually was. And we had the Rams and the Lions, which was the best game of the week and the game that had the best storyline and build up to it. Matthew Stafford returning home to Detroit. Jared Goff going up against the team that traded him as part of the Matthew Stafford trade. And Jared Goff had his moment as the Lions came away with a 1-point victory, but that did not come with controversy, as there was controversy in this game with the officiating towards the end. And there has been quite a bit of controversy in the primetime games this season, specifically Sunday night primetime games. There's been maybe at least 4 or 5 Sunday night football games this season where controversy by the officials has been talked about. And this Sunday was no different. Either way, the Lions got the win, their first playoff win in 32 years, and they are moving on to the divisional round. The Steelers and the Bills was Monday afternoon after being postponed due to the weather in Buffalo. And I got to give the Steelers credit. They stayed in the game for as long as they could. The difference in the game 2 Steelers turnovers that led to 14 points for the Bills. If the Steelers would have played clean football, if they would have not turned the ball over, I think there is a strong chance the Steelers could have either made it a lot closer or maybe even pulled off the upset. Which I give the Steelers credit, as that game was a lot closer than what a lot of people thought. I was reading posts about how the Bills would win 30-6 or 38-10 or 28-7. And the final game of the weekend, the Eagles and Buccaneers on Monday night. And the Buccaneers, despite the Eagles making it a game right before the half, the Buccaneers defense showed up. They slowed down the Eagles offense, and the Eagles defense just couldn't get many stops in this game. As I believe the Buccaneers crossed midfield on 7 consecutive possessions in the game. And we also got word today that Eagles center Jason Kelce announced his retirement to his teammates in the locker room. A legendary career by Jason Kelce. And I really don't want to put this into existence at the moment, but I have a strong feeling that his brother Travis Kelce will also be retiring at the end of the season, based off of what's been going on in pop culture throughout throughout the season. But we also have a lot of news that has taken place from the wildcard weekend prediction video to today, as it's a lot. Pete Carroll resigned. All of a sudden, the Seattle Seahawks, that is a coaching vacancy. As it really was a surprise, as just days before that, Pete Carroll was adamant that he had it in him to coach for one more year. I honestly wonder what was discussed with Pete Carroll and some other members in the Seahawks organization. And then on Wednesday, the biggest news in college football in a long time, Alabama head coach Nick Saban announced his retirement. And that was a moment where the sports world kind of stopped a little bit to reflect on everything Nick Saban has done and accomplished in his coaching career. On Friday morning, we had Gerard Mayo promoted as the head coach a day after it was announced that Bill Belichick and the Patriots were parting ways. It turns out that I had a comment in a YouTube short I did about it, where it was in Bill Belichick's contract that Gerard Mayo would be taking over. And I expressed how I was a little bit skeptical about this move, because with the way the NFL is now, where it's getting more offensive than it has ever before, I really feel like they would be better off if they went for an offensive guy. But at least with Gerard Mayo, at least he's someone that can understand the players. He can relate to the players really well, because he played in the NFL more recently than a lot of other coaches in the NFL. As I really feel like Gerard Mayo, he could be the next Antonio Pierce. A coach that can relate to the players, that played fairly recently. And I'm very intrigued to see what the Patriots do with the 3rd overall pick in April's draft. And then a couple hours later on Friday afternoon, it's announced that Washington head coach Kalen DeBoer will be the next head coach at Alabama. And the big question from Wednesday afternoon to Friday afternoon was, who would be the person to put the pressure on himself, try to follow up what Nick Saban accomplished at Alabama? And Kalen DeBoer, he was the guy that said, I will do it. As if I'm an Alabama fan, I'm absolutely stoked to have Kalen DeBoer. As Kalen DeBoer's resume, I feel like he has the best resume that you can have if you're replacing a legend in Nick Saban, as Kalen DeBoer has had success everywhere that he has went. And then Washington was opened up, and we got an announcement a couple days ago that Arizona head coach Jedd Fisch would be the next coach at Washington. And I like Jedd Fisch a lot. I think he's a very underrated coach, but I kind of wanted to see him be at Arizona for at least one more season. Arizona had a strong year, but I wish that I could see if 2023 Arizona was just a one-year wonder. As this is a massive risk for Washington, but it's a risk that I think they needed to take. As you don't want Jedd Fisch to be the one that got away. I think Jedd Fisch is either going to be one of the better coaches in college football 5 years from now, or he's not going to be at Washington. That's how much of a risk that it is for Washington, but it's a risk that it's worth taking. And now Arizona is open, and I will say, I think the Arizona Wildcats, I think that is a much better job than I think people realize, as Arizona is coming off of a very strong year with momentum from a bowl win. And maybe we'll see the Arizona job get taken between now and next week for the conference championship weekend video. But here are teams with coaching vacancies right now. Panthers, Falcons, Commanders, Seahawks, Titans, Raiders, and Chargers. Is it possible that the Cowboys or the Eagles will be open in the upcoming days? As I had a conversation with someone off the record, and this person asked me, will the Cowboys be open? Or when do I think we're going to get word on if the Cowboys move on from Mike McCarthy? And I told this person Wednesday afternoon. And if something happened before that, if we got news they parted way with Mike McCarthy before that, then I'm speculating that they have Bill Belichick on the line. And speaking of Bill Belichick, the Falcons are interested in Bill Belichick, and it's reported that the Falcons interview with Bill Belichick. The Raiders are interested in Jim Harbaugh, but the heart and soul of the Raiders defense, Max Crosby, has expressed full support of Antonio Pierce. And Jim Harbaugh has reportedly met with the Chargers for their coaching vacancy. That is all the news that has taken place since last week's video. If anything else takes place during the week, I will do a YouTube short on whatever it is, and then maybe go more in depth next week. Without further ado, let's get to the NFL playoff divisional round predictions. The first matchup of the weekend, Texans and Ravens. The Ravens won in week 1 against the Texans 25-9. However, if last week taught us anything, it's that what happens earlier in the season is irrelevant when it comes playoff time. As we saw the Browns with a dominant win over the Texans in week 16, but then a couple weeks later in the wild card round, the Texans turned around and had a dominant win over the Browns. Part of it was because C.J. Stroud was not in the week 16 matchup. Either way, even though the Ravens won 25-9 in week 1, the Texans, they were in that game. It was only 7-6 at halftime. C.J. Stroud, it was his first NFL game. And in that game, he went 28 for 44 for 242 yards. While Lamar Jackson went 17 for 22 for 169 yards and an interception. And he also had 38 rushing yards in that game. The top receivers in that game were Nico Collins for the Texans with 6 catches for 80 yards, and Zay Flowers for the Ravens with 9 catches and 78 yards. I also want to point out the defenses in this matchup. As the Texans, they have shown that they have an underrated defense. Lamar Jackson was sacked 4 times in the week 1 matchup, while C.J. Stroud was sacked 5 times. The Ravens have 60 sacks on the year, which is the most in the NFL. And something I want to bring up, Mark Andrews is reportedly being activated off the IR, as it looked like Mark Andrews is going to be out for the entire rest of the season after the Bengals game where he sustained a ankle injury. But he is reportedly going to be activated for the IR, and he is perhaps the last piece the Ravens need for this Super Bowl run. And I also want to point out the Ravens, they signed Dalvin Cook a couple weeks back for a playoff run. Last week, we finally saw C.J. Stroud flourish against a top defense in the league. As last week I had mentioned that the Texans and C.J. Stroud do not do well against top half defenses in the league, typically. As last week was only their second win against a top 16 defense this year. The Texans' strength is their run defense. And if the Texans can take away Lamar Jackson's ability to extend plays, I think the Texans, they have a chance to pull off the upset. Well, the Ravens may not have been the top defense in the league from a stat standpoint in the regular season. I do feel like the Ravens' defense is perhaps the most talented in the league. I am going to pick the Ravens to win this matchup. However, I do think that the Texans, they may be able to cover the spread in this game, as the spread right now is the Ravens at -9.5. I think DeMeco Ryans, I think he's got a good game plan to make this game close, but in the end, I just think the Texans, I think they're going to be, I think this is too much of a challenge for them at this point, at the stage of their franchise. As C.J. Stroud, he did pass the first test last week, as it was his first career playoff game, but now it's C.J. Stroud's first career road playoff game. And I just think with Lamar Jackson being rested, I think this time around it's going to be more beneficial. I think the Ravens, they just escape in this game, as I do think the Texans, they just be able to cover this 9.5. But either way, I think the Ravens, they end up winning outright, but I would watch out for the cover. The second matchup of the week, Packers and 49ers. And this is another spread that sticks out to me. Right now, the spread is set at 49ers -9.5. What you're looking for is for the 49ers to win by 10 points. A double-digit win. I want to point out that since the 49ers, they traded for Chase Young, they are 7-2. And those two losses are to the Ravens on Christmas night and Week 18 against the Rams, when they were resting their starters anyway. The average margin of victory for the 49ers in those 7 games, 18.5 points per game. In their 12 wins this season, their average margin of victory is just over 19 points per game. Out of those 12 wins they have this season, 11 of them have been by more than 10 points. The only time they did not win by double digits this season was in Week 2 against the Rams, where they had a 10-point lead at the very end, but the Rams kicked a field goal to make it a 7-point game instead of a 10-point game at the very end. Other than that, the 49ers, they have won by double digits every time they have won. And with this information, you would think you'd want to pick the 49ers to win and cover, because the 49ers win based off this season, they will cover. But I think that is exactly what the you-know-whos want you to think and do. The Packers may be the youngest team in the playoffs, and they may be the youngest team in the playoffs in 40, 50 years. But for the Packers to go on the road and win the way they did against the Cowboys, scoring 48 points against one of the best defenses in the league, that is nothing to take lightly. If the Packers would have beaten the Cowboys last week, well, if you would have told me the Packers were going to win against the Cowboys, I would have thought that it was going to be a low-scoring game where the Packers kept themselves in the game by utilizing Aaron Jones. They did utilize Aaron Jones. 118 yards and 3 touchdowns. Averaged 5.6 yards per carry. The Packers, as a team, had 415 yards of offense last week against the Cowboys defense. A defense that has been one of the best in the league the last 2 seasons. Since week 11, Jordan Love has 21 touchdown passes and only 1 interception. As week 11 was the true turning point in the Packers season, as in the weeks leading up to that game, Jordan Love had been struggling. He had a few weeks in the year where he was having a hard time. He was having a difficult time. He had bad games. But since week 11, he has looked like a Hall of Fame quarterback. Very efficient, not turning the ball over. And that's going to be a big key for the Packers in this game if they're going to win. The Packers just have to play clean football and keep themselves in it for as long as they can. The longer they're in the game, the better of a chance they have at winning the game. Christian McCaffrey sustained a calf injury in week 17. He sat out in week 18 along with a lot of the 49ers starters. And with them having the bye week, when they play this game on Saturday, just like the Ravens, it's going to be nearly 3 weeks since the starters for the Ravens and 49ers, they've both played. So that could be some concern there. But I think the 49ers, they win this game. However, I think the Packers will do just enough in this game to cover the 9.5. Because I feel like that is what the you-know-whos want you to not know about. They want you to follow the current narrative that's been playing out throughout the season, where the 49ers have won by double digits 11 out of the 12 games they've won. But I think the Packers, they do enough to cover the 9.5. I think the Packers keep it close. Game number 3, Buccaneers and Lions. And I want to point out the current spread is Lions minus 6.5. Another rematch from earlier in the season. The Lions won by a score of 20-6. But again, if last week taught us anything, it's that what happens in the regular season may not necessarily matter when it's playoff time. As so far in the playoffs, the rematches have not gone well for the teams that won in the regular season. But one thing I have learned about these two teams is that throughout the year, both of these defenses hasn't particularly stopped the pass very well. But both defenses have been able to stop the run fairly well throughout the year. The Buccaneers pass defense did a stellar job against the Eagles last week on Monday Night Football. While the Lions pass defense, it looked like the pass defense that we've seen throughout the year. And I think we're going to be in for a lot more points than the 26 we got when they faced off in the regular season. A lot of people may argue that the Lions are coming off of an emotional victory. Matthew Stafford returning home to Detroit, a homecoming game for Matthew Stafford. The Lions having to play all 60 minutes against a very underrated Rams team and winning their first playoff game in over 3 decades. The Lions may be feeling this euphoria that they aren't focused on the very next week. But this Lions team, they have overcome so much adversity this year, and the Buccaneers have as well, as there were a lot of question marks for the Buccaneers in their first season post Tom Brady. The Buccaneers may have been in the NFC South, but They still made the playoffs. They won convincingly against the Eagles last week. And the Lions, we saw how they ended their year last year, as they got on a hot streak to end the year. And there were fairly high expectations for the Lions, especially after they upset the Chiefs in week 1 in the season opener. It was at that point that we were expecting a special season for the Lions. And they got on a roll. They did have a little bit of a setback on Thanksgiving Day, though, an abysmal performance against the Packers. But the Lions, they are the team that could. And I don't want to necessarily put this out there, but this season's Lions team, in a way, it reminds me of the Bengals from a couple of years ago. A Bengals team that flew under the radar and had a special season. They ended a playoff drought, made it all the way to the Super Bowl, and ended up being just short of hoisting the Lombardi Trophy. And I think that the Lions, they have what it takes to go all the way and hoist the Lombardi Trophy. I do think in a very high scoring game, I think the Lions, they win this matchup. I anticipate that both Baker Mayfield and Jared Goff are going to have good days against these secondaries. And this game is, in my opinion, going to be decided by who has the ball last. And I think that will be the Detroit Lions. And I think the Lions, they win another playoff game a week after ending their 32-year playoff drought, well, playoff victory drought, and they move on to the NFC Championship game. But I want to point out that whichever team happens to be on the losing end of this game, they need to have their heads held up high for a stellar season they had, as these two teams, they really flew under the radar this year. And whichever fan base loses this game, you should be proud of what your favorite team accomplished this season. But I just think that the Lions will be the ones that move on. The fourth and final game of the week, Chiefs and Bills. And what a way to end the weekend. Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs versus Josh Allen and the Bills. And more often than not, when these two teams are against each other, it is a classic, and I'm hoping that Sunday is no different. We saw these two face off in the regular season, where the Bills won against the Chiefs in Arrowhead. And it was a monumental victory for the Bills, as it was a must-win for the Bills, as there was talks about whether or not the Bills would make the playoffs. But the Bills, they won 5 in a row to get the 2 seed in the AFC, a win against the Steelers last week on Monday. And keep that in mind, because I will say that them playing on Monday, I think, will be a key in this matchup. I'll explain in a moment. But it was a very controversial game when we saw these two teams face off last. The Chiefs had the go-ahead touchdown erased off the board by a Kadarius Toney offsides penalty. And Patrick Mahomes was absolutely irate on the sidelines as he was screaming at the officials, getting emotional and angry. And the Chiefs have been frustrated throughout most of the season. Even on Christmas Day, Travis Kelce was shown being very irate and emotional on the sidelines. And it was captured that he was very angry. I'm not surprised by it, because it seems like at least once a season, Travis Kelce is shown being irate and emotional. And I think a lot of people will be siding with the Bills in this matchup, as the Bills, on paper, they're the more confident team right now, as the Bills have now won 6 in a row, 7 out of their last 8 at this point in the year. And I was impressed with both teams last week. However, I was a little bit more impressed by the Chiefs. The Chiefs against the Dolphins, I can understand if you would feel like that was the best performance we have seen from the Chiefs all year long. And if you're having the best performances of the year in the playoffs, then you are a major contender to hoist the Lombardi Trophy when it's all said and done. As the Dolphins defense, they did just about everything they could. And the Chiefs, they could have potentially won by a lot more. But that Dolphins defense, they were in it, but the Dolphins offense just couldn't generate much offense, except for the one scoring drive they had. While the Bills, they did kind of exactly what I expect them to do. But the Steelers, they had the potential of making it a lot closer than what it was. The Bills capitalized on the Steelers' turnovers. A minute ago, I did reference the Bills playing on Monday last week was going to come into play for this prediction. The Chiefs played on Saturday last week. The Bills played on Monday. Despite the Bills being at home and not having to travel, this is a short week for them. Well, the Chiefs, they have 2 extra days of rest that I think will pay dividends in this matchup. And I don't want to be this kind of person, but the comments that I received in the comment section last week about the NFL necessarily scripting the games or fixing the games, that I don't think that they go out of the way to do that. But I did say last week that I think they have desired outcomes. And if they have a desired outcome, more often than not, that said outcome will take place. I don't think it's an overwhelming amount. I would say if they had 100 outcomes that they would desire, I think maybe 60 to 65 of them would take place. And I think that this is one of those desired outcomes. Because there were talks about how the NFL needs to postpone Dolphins and Chiefs because the National Weather Service said that it was unsafe to play. It was very hazardous conditions to play out there. But the NFL, they went on with the game anyway as scheduled, but they postponed Steelers and Bills back a day. And the fact that Chiefs have 2 extra days of rest, when originally they would have only had 1 if they didn't push back Steelers Bills, I think they're trying to give the Chiefs an edge here. And I think there's a reason why they have the Bills as a 2.5-point favorite. I think the Chiefs, in a game that has the potential of going back and forth, I think they win by 3 points. And that will do it for my divisional round predictions. Comment your picks down below. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. I also want to thank everyone that tuned in last week, as last week's video was the 6th highest viewed video in the history of the channel. And this is all for me this week. If something were to happen during the week, I will do a YouTube short on it and maybe go more in depth on it next week. Enjoy the games this weekend, and until next time.